Okay, hello everyone. This is Colin Cox, and this is the Week 11 audio for English 1010 here at Northeast State Community College. So, we are currently in the midst of the research essay benchmark assignment and the research essay assignment. As always, if you have any questions, please email me. But what I wanted to do today quickly, because this will be a shorter audio lecture than perhaps some in the past, I want to just take a moment and review some of the things, some of the ideas that I discussed last week with sources and assessing source credibility. I also wanted to say a quick something about using the advanced search function when using the online databases that I mentioned last week. If you check the announcements feed, you'll see that I provided some links and instructions to find those databases specifically, and I'll talk about this more in just a few moments. I'm referencing something like Academic One file, but before I get to that, and then finally at the end, I wanted to say something about using sources and again assessing the credibility of sources that you may and certainly can find outside of these online databases that are available through the Northeast State Community College Library. But let's start with just reviewing some of the things I discussed last week when assessing the possible credibility of a source. And one of the first things I said when thinking about source credibility, it's important not to think about credibility in binary terms, which is to say, don't think or don't imagine that a source is either credible or it's not credible. I think something like source credibility is far more complicated than that. Again, review last week's audio lecture because I discussed a variety of different characteristics that a potential source might have that may increase or decrease its credibility. Anything and everything from, is it peer reviewed or not? Do you know the author or authors' names? Do you see, for example, references to other sources within a potential source? Do you have something like a publication date? All of these questions and all of these characteristics, if a potential source has them or makes that information available, would do the work of enhancing the credibility of a source. And while I don't necessarily know if this is something that I need to say, you would obviously want on your works cited page, the sources you use for your research essay, you would want those sources to be as credible as possible. Obviously, building an argument based off of secondary sources, research, etc., for your argument to have validity and credibility, your sources would also need to have validity and credibility. So, again, review some of the things that I mentioned last week about source credibility. And if you have any questions about a possible source, if you want my commentary or you just want to know what I think about a possible source, you can certainly always email me. And there's one thing I mentioned just a second ago that I don't think I've spoken about before. Maybe I have, but I'll go ahead and describe it now, which is the peer review process. So, most, if not all, of the sources that you might find through the library databases, you have the option to search for only peer-reviewed sources. Now, the peer review process, it's not something exclusive to academic publications, but it is something that many academic publications, specifically academic journals, use as a mechanism to enhance the credibility and validity of sources. And so basically, the way it works is this. If you just imagine, for example, that you want to publish something through an academic journal within a particular discipline, you write this essay or this paper, and the editors for this journal then request a peer review process for the particular essay or paper that you have written. What they would then do, they would commission or find scholars, researchers, people who have written and published within the particular field or discipline that your essay or paper might fall into. They would simply ask them to read your work and offer thoughts, criticism, and commentary. In some instances, during the peer review process, the peers who then review your work might offer some suggestions. They may have particular problems with either your research, your conclusions, your thesis, etc. They may make recommendations about how you can and should change your work. Or in some cases, if you wrote an excellent essay, they may say something as simple as, no, all of this sounds fantastic. Maybe they noticed a couple of small sentence level cosmetic errors, but they, at the end of this process, may either approve or disapprove of your work. That is essentially what the peer review process is. And at the end of that process, the particular academic journal in question, again, we're imagining hypothetically that you have written an essay or a paper and you want to publish it with an academic journal, they would perhaps recommend you make certain changes, or they may decide that we really like this essay, we trust the people who have reviewed it, and we are prepared to publish it. What I would encourage you to do is just think about what that additional level of editing might say and suggest about your essay, and also just thinking about it here as students who are attempting to find, again, sources that are as credible as possible. That would provide an additional level of assurance, and that would be another characteristic that would enhance the potential credibility of a source. I say all of that, and I would just want to offer one caveat, which is like any editorial practice, the peer review process is far from perfect. But again, if the larger question that we want to consider and explore is, well, what can I do to ensure that my work is as credible as possible? What can I do to ensure that the researched material I use to build my argument is as credible as possible, knowing that a particular source was peer reviewed would do the work of enhancing the credibility of that source. And when you use those academic online databases, you can just select as one of the limiting factors, I want peer reviewed essays, or I am happy to have a combination of peer reviewed and non peer reviewed essays. So the peer review process is extremely useful, again, especially when thinking about and considering questions of credibility. Let's transition now to a quick conversation about how to use the advanced search. And I would say as well, on D2L in UJA, if you look at that bar at the top where you can select things like assignments, content, to the far right, you'll see something called UJA, YUJA. You should be familiar with this because I've provided video content throughout the semester, but especially for the research essay, you'll see far more content than I've provided for any essay unit thus far. And one of those videos is about the advanced search, how to use it, what it's like, why it's important, why it's useful. Because this is an audio only medium, it's difficult for me to actually show you how the advanced search function works. So I would encourage you to watch that video. But at the very least, what I wanted to do was just say a few things about why it can be useful, under what circumstances you should use it. Because when you go, for example, to something like Academic OneFile, you see on that main page just a basic search bar. And with that basic search bar, it is quite limited because you can only search for perhaps a particular word or a combination of words, a short phrase, for example. But with the advanced search, what that allows you to do is expand, or in some cases, refine your search, because it allows you to search using multiple search terms. It allows you, for example, to search for particular terms in conjunction with perhaps a particular author. So the advanced search function can be quite useful in that way. It's something that I often encourage students to do after they've decided on a particular topic, after they perform some of these basic searches through something like Academic OneFile. If you are, for example, having difficulty finding the sources you want, one of the best things to do, a great way to pivot from there, is to then use the advanced search. So watch the UJA video that I made available at some point this past week. regarding the advanced search function, how it works, how it operates, because what I provide in those videos, which I think is far more useful than what I can provide here in this audio only medium, is a visual representation of what it can look like. So I would strongly encourage you to go and watch that video because, again, there's just limits to what I can do here. So the final thing, again, that I wanted to discuss in this lecture is addressing non-academic database sources and doing so with this larger question of credibility in mind. Because if you read the research essay prompt, not the benchmark prompt, but the research essay prompt, you'll see there's no language that says or suggests that you must only use those online academic databases available through the library website. You can certainly use sources that you find on the internet, sources that you may find in books, particular chapters, introductions, etc. But like with anything, questions of credibility are extremely important. So what I will do, I want to use an example, and I will provide a link in the notes to this particular audio lecture through YouTube, and I'll provide a visual example in the announcements feed for this course. And I would encourage you to, as I'm discussing this, read and review those screenshots, and also just follow the link right there in the notes for this audio lecture. So I am using a website called Vox, V-O-X, Vox.com, and I am assessing the possible credibility of a source or a particular essay, paper, post about how it seems as if American consumers are not consuming as much veal as apparently they once consumed. And so what I see here, and again, I'm just looking here at the beginning of the piece, I see a publication date along with an updated on March 26, 2026. I see a title, I see an author, and like with even information that you can find through the online databases, I can select the author's name and I can learn more about who she is. Her name, for example, is Marina Bolotnikova, and I'm simply reading here. She is a senior reporter. She covers moral and technological problems, global poverty, inequality, specifically inequality as it relates to factory farming. So it seems like she is the perfect sort of person to report on consumers and whether or not they are or are not consuming more or less veal. What I also see just from the piece itself, and here I'm just reading the first couple of paragraphs. Now, this is important to remember. We will use MLA documentation standards for this research essay, and what you see from MLA is a final works cited page, and then within the essay itself, these parenthetical in-text citations that reference complete and full information on the works cited page. I provided a lot of information in the research essay module. Most online publications do not do that. Some of you, for example, might be familiar with APA. They do not use APA either. They typically hyperlink information, which is why in the opening paragraph, you can see this reference to 9 million babies born to dairy cows each year. And the language 9 million, do you see how the piece has underlined it? When you then select it, it takes you to that source. So that gives you the indication that this author, she's not just concocting this number, she's referencing that. If you were to use something like this in your research essay, you wouldn't create a hyperlink like this. You would create an in-text citation, which I could then go to your full works cited page to see and find information about the source in its entirety. So please keep that in mind. Online sources typically use this hyperlink citation format. We will not do that. We will use MLA documentation format. But in addition to just providing the opportunity to check and confirm if these links are real and to actually then read the information provided with those sources through those links, I always like to just see how often someone references borrowed material. Like with everything we've discussed, citing a lot of sources does not necessarily mean that someone's argument is credible or that they even use the information correctly, that they fully understand the context. But what's wonderful about not only seeing these sources, but having the opportunity to then read them and assess them yourself, you can conclude whether or not you think a particular author understands the context of the material they borrow. But at the very least, seeing all of these references, seeing all of these potential sources, means that this is not a piece that, this is not, for example, an opinion piece. Now, she might agree with the argument she makes. This may be an opinion she holds, and you may arrive at that conclusion after reading the piece. That doesn't, for example, decrease the credibility of a piece. But knowing that she builds this reporting with and through additional sources, that it's not just something she's concocted in her head, I think enhances the credibility of this source. As I said just a moment ago, it's still important to check her sources, see if they are valid. At the very least, are these links to the sources that she claims they're links to? Because if they're not, then I think that might decrease the credibility of this source. I think it's quite easy now, and I think this is an excellent opportunity to pause and really think about information that you may or may not find on the internet. It is quite easy to make something appear visually credible. And I think all of us should do the work of, before just accepting an argument or deciding that a particular piece is credible, let's check the sources just for a moment. At the very least, does the author actually link to information that they claim to link to? Because, again, it's quite easy to make something appear visually credible. People now know, they've learned how to do that. So it's extremely incumbent upon all of us to do that additional work to ensure that our sources are as credible as possible. Something else that I would encourage you to do, this has perhaps less to do with credibility and more to do with just finding sources for yourself for the research essay you want to write. If you find, let us imagine that you wanted to write an essay about the decrease in veal consumption, or perhaps you want to write an essay about factory farming and you think this particular piece would be quite useful to you, you can use sources that your sources use. That is to say, don't hesitate to mine the bibliographies, works cited pages, etc. of sources you find, because if you find a particular source and you think it's credible, you think it makes sense, you think it forwards and develops your argument, it's entirely possible that the sources they use, maybe not all of them, but some of them would be useful and relevant to your research essay. This is an excellent way to build a comprehensive and robust works cited page. If you find an excellent essay, see if any of their sources are sources you can use as well. But without having read this full piece, again, I wanted to use this as an example more than anything else. I think this piece has a lot of the characteristics that I would associate with a credible source, but as always, it's important to read the piece in its entirety, check, confirm the sources. Something that I like, and I'll see if Vox does this, I know they have in the past, they'll often list when they make updates. Now, I know at the beginning, this piece indicates that it was updated. Some non-academic database sources, they show a list of the times they've updated a source. That might lead you to think, or that might indicate that a source lacks credibility, but I often think that anytime someone has done the work of updating a piece, making changes, whether those changes were big or small, that might do the work of enhancing the credibility of a source. If someone refuses to update their work, because who among us is always right? I think knowing that someone would be inclined to make particular changes, I think that also has the effect of enhancing the credibility of a source. So if you see a list of times the piece was updated, now this can only go so far. If you see, for example, that a piece was published 4 days ago and the editors and the writer or writers have updated it 2 dozen times, I don't know. That might give you an indication that, well, there was something fundamentally flawed about the original piece, and all of these updates, what on earth are they attempting to do? Should they not perhaps just remove the piece from publication? But a few updates, I often like to see that. I think, again, that can do the work of enhancing the credibility of a source because that says or suggests something quite positive and potentially something credible about the author or the authors, the editor, the editors, or the piece, excuse me, or the publication, the website, etc., that published the piece. So, okay, I think that's where I want to stop because I said this would be a bit of a shorter audio lecture. If any of you have any questions or any concerns about either your research essay benchmark assignment or your research essay assignment, please do not hesitate to email me. But for now, for English 1010 here at Northeast State Community College, this is Colin Cox. Have a nice day, and I'll talk to you soon.